The girl had not spoken in 41 days. The doctors had written it in their reports. The therapists had noted it in their files. The nurses on the fourth floor of Meridian Children's Specialty Clinic had stopped trying to draw her out after the third week. They left her meals on the tray and retrieved them mostly untouched. They changed her IV bags and checked her vitals and spoke to her in careful, cheerful voices that she did not acknowledge. She was 11 years old. Her name was Nora. She sat in the same position every afternoon, knees drawn to her chest, back against the headboard, face turned slightly toward the window. There was nothing to see through that window. She was blind, had been since the accident 8 months ago. But she turned toward it anyway, as though the warmth of afternoon light through glass was the one remaining thing she could receive without having to give anything back. No one knew what she was listening for, she never said. On the morning of the 42nd day, a man arrived on her floor pushing a service cart. Mop, bucket, gray uniform, laminate badge clipped to his chest pocket. He was not a doctor, he was not a therapist. He had no appointment, no file, no plan. He stopped outside room 412. He looked through the narrow window in the door. He looked for exactly 4 seconds. Then he pushed his cart to the supply room, set his mop against the wall, sat down on an upturned bucket and took a paperback book from his front pocket. The cover was worn at the corners. He had clearly read it before. He walked back to room 412. He knocked twice lightly. No answer. He opened the door anyway, took the chair beside the window, sat down and began to read aloud. His name was Daniel.She. He was 43 years old. He was 6 feet tall but stood slightly shorter, as men sometimes do when they have carried too many things for too many years and the weight has pressed them gradually earthward. His hands were large and careful, the hands of someone who had learned in some previous life to be precise. His nails were always clean. His uniform was always pressed. The other custodial staff at Meridian Complex noticed this and most said nothing about it, and 1 or 2 secretly found it irritating. He had worked at Meridian Complex for 2 years and 4 months. Meridian Complex was not a hospital. It was not precisely an office building either. It occupied floors 3 through 31 of the Meridian Tower at 1400 Glass Bay Boulevard in the Financial District, and it housed in ascending order a law firm, 3 investment banks, a private equity group, and on floors 27 through 31, the headquarters of Meridian Capital Partners. The clinic occupied a separate wing of floors 4 and 5, adjacent to the main tower, accessible by a glass corridor. It was a private clinic, expensive, the kind that sent embossed billing statements instead of forms. Daniel cleaned floors 4 and 5 of the clinic wing. He had asked for that assignment. The supervisor at the time, a man named Richie who wore his keys on a carabiner and spoke very quickly, had found this unusual. Most staff preferred the main tower. The clinic paid the same rate and smelled like antiseptic, and everyone on those floors was either sick or grieving or both. Daniel had said simply, "It's closer to the elevator." Richie had shrugged and updated the schedule. Daniel's daughter was named Amara. She was 8 years old. She attended Lakeview Primary, 2 bus stops from their apartment on Fenwick Street. She had her father's wide, serious eyes and her mother's habit of humming while she ate. She was currently in remission from a form of pediatric leukemia that Daniel could not say aloud without his jaw tightening. Her mother, Daniel's wife, Grace, had died 4 years ago, not from the leukemia. Grace had never been sick a day in her life. She was killed by a driver who ran a red light at the intersection of Broad and 7th on a Tuesday morning in March while she was walking to the pharmacy. The pharmacy was 3 blocks from their apartment. She had gone to pick up Amara's prescription. Daniel did not speak about Grace to his colleagues. There was a photograph on his phone's lock screen, Grace and Amara at a beach somewhere, both laughing, Grace's scarf lifting in the wind. He kept the phone in his breast pocket and did not look at it at work. He had been before Meridian Complex, before the gray uniform, before the mop and the cart and the laminate badge, a structural engineer, 13 years of it. He had worked for a firm called Holborn Associates, and before that he had done his master's degree at the Federal University of Technology in Acure, graduating 3rd in his cohort. He had designed 2 highway bridges. He had co-authored a paper on load distribution in asymmetric spans that was still cited occasionally in academic journals. He had been, his colleagues at Holborn used to say, constitutionally incapable of making a careless calculation. He had left the firm when Grace died. There was no one else to collect Amara from school, no one else to sit with her at the clinic during infusions, no one else to be there at 6:47 every morning when she woke up and called for him from her room. The firm had offered flexibility. He had tried it for 3 months and it had not been enough. He had looked at his daughter one evening, while she slept and understood with the same clarity with which he understood load-bearing mathematics that he could not divide himself and have either half be sufficient. He had taken the custodial position the following month. He did not regret it, or if he did, he kept that separate from the part of himself that showed up every day and pressed his uniform and cleaned his floors with the same precision he had once applied to structural tolerances. He had his lunch always the same: rice in a steel container and orange, a small thermos of black tea at 12:45 in the corridor outside the fourth-floor supply room. He sat on the same upturned bucket. He ate without his phone out. He did not listen to music. He was often simply quiet, in the way of someone who has discovered that noise no longer fills the thing it used to fill. He had noticed room 412 in his second week on the clinic floors. He noticed things. It was structural, this tendency, the eye trained to observe tolerance and deviation. The girl in room 412 was a deviation, not in the clinical sense. In the quieter sense, the way a room can hold grief like a load-bearing wall holds weight invisibly everywhere at once. He had felt it through the narrow window each time he passed. He had not acted on it for 2 months. He was not an impulsive man. He had read to Amara every night since she was 3 months old. He kept a collection of books in the apartment, not many, they downsized twice since Grace died, but a careful selection. A battered copy of the Phantom Toll Booth that had belonged to Grace's mother, a water-stained paperback of The Hobbit, a slender volume of West African folk tales with illustrations Amara sometimes asked him to describe. He had in his previous life no particular opinion of literature. In his current life, it had become the most reliable technology he knew for reaching another human being when nothing else worked. He was not a man of grand gestures. He was a man who understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has built things, that the right structure placed correctly bears tremendous weight. On the morning of the 42nd day, he had stood outside room 412 for 4 seconds. He had seen the girl with her knees drawn up, her face turned toward the window. He had thought of Amara during her 3rd round of chemo when she stopped speaking for 9 days, not because she couldn't, because speech required something she didn't have to spare. He had retrieved the book from his pocket. He had knocked. He had gone in. The book was The Phantom Toll Booth by Nora.She. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask her name. He did not say he hoped she didn't mind or ask permission or explain his presence. He simply sat down in the chair by the window, opened to the first page, and began. There was once a boy named Milo who didn't know what to do with himself, not just sometimes, but always, every day, all the time. He read in a low, even voice, not a performance, not a children's story voice with inflections and sound effects, simply a voice steady and real, the way a man reads when he means it. The girl did not move. He read for 20 minutes, then his break was over. He stood, placed a folded strip of paper inside the book as a bookmark, set it on the windowsill, and left. He said as he passed through the door, "I'll finish the rest tomorrow." He pulled the door closed. In room 412, the girl's knees lowered fractionally from her chest. The CEO of Meridian Capital Partners was named Catherine Voss. She was 49 years old. She had been CEO for 6 years, and before that she had been CFO for 4 years, and before that she had risen through the firm's analyst structure with a consistency that colleagues described, depending on their relationship with her, as either formidable or exhausting. She worked from 6:15 a.m. to sometimes 11:00 p.m. She took no vacations that lasted longer than 4 days. She had a personal assistant named Jake who intercepted approximately 90% of the communications that would otherwise consume her. She trusted Jake completely, which was one of her few genuine errors of judgment. Her daughter Nora was the product of a marriage that had ended amicably, they both said, meaning without screaming, 3 years ago. Her ex-husband, Thomas Voss, was a man of good intentions who had come to understand that he was not constitutionally equipped to be secondary to an institution. Catherine had not disagreed with his assessment. She had felt when he left a grief she did not have time to sit with, and so she had not sat with it, and it had become something compressed and structural inside her, load-bearing in its own way. The accident that took Nora's sight had happened 8 months ago. A horse-riding lesson, a fence, a fall at the wrong angle. The doctors had been sorry and precise. Catherine had sat in a waiting room in a gray suit and listened to a man explain what had happened to her daughter's optic nerves and felt something shift inside her that she did not have vocabulary for. She had done everything that could be done, the best specialists, the clinic, the therapists, 4 of them sequentially, each one reporting the same thing in different language. The girl was not responding. The girl had chosen silence. Catherine came to the clinic every evening at 6:30. She sat with Nora for 45 minutes. She talked about the office, about small things, about nothing in particular in a voice that was careful and tired. Nora sat with her face toward the window. Catherine watched her daughter's profile and felt the distance between them like the span of an unbridged gap, and she thought of the office, and then she hated herself for thinking of the office, and then she thought of it again. On the 43rd day, she arrived at 6:30 as usual. She stopped in the doorway. The girl was different. Not dramatically, not some cinematic transformation, but different in the way a room is different when a window has been opened, the same room but with air in it. Nora was still sitting upright against the headboard, but her knees were not pressed to her chest. They were bent loosely sideways, and on the bed beside her was a worn paperback book. Catherine said, "What's that?" Nora said nothing, but her hand moved slightly to the cover of the book. Catherine stepped inside. She looked at the book, The Phantom Toll Booth. She did not recognize it. She looked at her daughter's hand resting on the cover. She sat down. She talked as she always did. Nora did not respond. But at some point during the visit, Nora's head turned not toward the window, toward her mother for approximately 4 seconds. Then she turned back. Catherine left at 7:15. She sat in her car in the clinic parking structure for 11 minutes without starting the engine. She asked Jake the next morning. Someone left a book in room 412, find out who. Jake had the answer by 10 a.m. He knocked on her office door and looked at his tablet and said, "Custodial staff, one of the cleaners on floor 4, name's Daniel.She." She turned from the window, "A cleaner?" "Oh, yes." "He went into my daughter's room." Apparently, yes. According to the floor log, he accessed room 412 at 12:47 p.m. on Tuesday, 22-minute duration. Did anyone authorize this? Jake opened his mouth and then said carefully, "I don't see an authorization on file." She looked at him for a moment. "Get Dr. Reeves." Dr. Reeves was the clinic's senior attending physician and informally the coordinator of Nora's care team. He arrived within the hour, which was unusually fast, because Catherine Voss's calls were never slow to produce results. What happened next, Catherine would later understand differently than she understood it at the time. At the time, she was running on 4 hours of sleep. She had a board presentation in 36 hours. She had just come from a meeting with the firm's legal team about a regulatory matter she could not discuss with anyone who wasn't in that room. She had sat with her silent daughter for 45 minutes the previous evening, and the 45 minutes before that, and the 45 minutes before that. She was not malicious, she was not cruel. She was a woman who had learned that control was the primary instrument of survival, and that when something in her domain operated outside her sanctioned parameters, the correct response was to correct it. She told Dr. Reeves that unauthorized personnel had accessed her daughter's room, and she needed that to not happen again. Dr. Reeves told HR. HR contacted the facilities manager. The facilities manager, a woman named Sandra Cho, who had been in the role for 11 months and was still finding her footing, pulled Daniel's file, noted that he had entered a private patient room without documented authorization, and sent him a written notice. The notice said that his access to clinic floors 4 and 5 was suspended pending a review. He was to report to floors 6 through 9 of the main tower, effective immediately. Sandra delivered it personally, which she did not usually do, because the notice felt significant in a way she couldn't entirely justify. Daniel was in the corridor outside the supply room eating his lunch, rice, orange, black tea. He read the notice once. He folded it in half. He said, "All right." Sandra said, "Daniel, I want you to know I'm required to." "I understand," he said. He placed the folded notice in his breast pocket. He finished his orange. He finished his tea. He stood, placed everything neatly in his bag, and went to collect his cart. He was on the 6th floor by 1 p.m. He was not angry. This also, years later, would be the detail that people found most difficult to believe. He had understood, reading the notice, what had happened, not the specific mechanism. He did not yet know about Jake's inquiry or HR's involvement or Sandra's discomfort, but the structure of it was clear enough. He had entered a room he was not assigned to. Someone with authority over that room had objected. He had been moved. He understood authority. He understood institutions. He had worked inside them long enough in engineering in the corporate world and now here to know that they operated primarily according to their own structural logic, and that arguing with structural logic when you had no leverage was simply an expenditure of energy that produced nothing. He's thought about Nora. He thought about the book still on the windowsill. He thought she won't know where I went. This was the thing that settled in his chest like something heavy, not the demotion, not the indignity of the notice. The simpler, more specific thing, the girl in the room would not know why the voice had stopped. He had made a commitment, I'll finish the rest tomorrow. He could not finish it. The 44th day. 12:47 came and went. In room 412, Nora sat with her knees drawn to her chest again. Her hand was on the windowsill next to the book. She waited. 1 o'clock, 1:30. At 2:15, a nurse came to do vitals. The nurse was cheerful and careful and said several things to which Nora did not respond. The nurse noted in her log, patient appears agitated, increased withdrawal observed, no vocalization. The 45th day. Same. The 46th day. Catherine arrived at 6:30 and found Nora back against the headboard, knees to chest, face to window. The small, fractional change she had witnessed 3 days ago had closed over like water. Catherine sat down, she talked about nothing for 45 minutes. Nora did not turn her head. Catherine looked at the book on the windowsill. She picked it up. She looked at it, the bookmark, a strip of folded paper, was somewhere past the halfway mark. On the folded strip of paper in a small, precise hand were 3 words, page 89, continue. Catherine put the book down. She left at 7:15. She asked Jake in the morning, the cleaner, Osai, what happened to him. Jake looked at his tablet. He was reassigned floors 6 through 9. Reassigned when? 3 days ago. She was quiet for a moment. Jake said carefully, the notice went through HR and Sandra Cho, standard protocol for unauthorized room access. You'd asked Dr. Reeves to make sure. Yes, she said, I know. She looked at her desk. On it, arranged in a precise row, were 3 framed photographs, her parents, Nora at age 7 before the accident laughing at something off camera, Thomas and Nora at a beach, both of them squinting into the sun. Pull his file, she said. She read it that evening. Not in the office. In her apartment at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she didn't drink after calling the clinic to check on Nora. The file was not long. It had the standard items, start date, assignment history, performance reviews, all reviews rated excellent. One note from Richie, the previous supervisor, reliable, efficient, keeps to himself, no issues. A note from Sandra Cho added after the reassignment, accepted notice without dispute. There was also, because Catherine had specifically asked Jake for the full HR file and Jake had been thorough, a copy of the application form. She looked at the education section. Master of Science, Structural Engineering, Federal University of Technology, Acure. She looked at the employment history section. Holborn Associates, Structural Engineering, 13 years, Senior Project Engineer. She set the file down. She picked up her wine, she put it down again. She thought about the bookmark, page 89, continue. She opened her laptop, she looked up the book, The Phantom Toll Booth. She read the plot summary, she read to page 89. At page 89, Milo arrives at a place called the Valley of Sound, where all the sounds in the world have been locked away. The world is silent, and a boy walks through it lost. She closed the laptop. She did not recognize the expression on her own face in the glass of her kitchen window. The revelation did not come from Catherine. It came from a 24-year-old junior analyst named Priya Menon, who had nothing to do with any of this, and would later be quietly grateful that she had stumbled into it anyway. Priya worked on the 28th floor of Meridian Tower. She was smart and careful and slightly afraid of Jake, as most junior staff were. On the 47th day, she was retrieving a document from the printer room on the 4th floor of the clinic wing. She had been sent on a minor errand that fell technically outside her job description, which happened with some regularity, when she encountered one of the clinic nurses in the corridor. The nurse was a woman named Marie, who had worked on floor 4 for 6 years and had opinions she usually kept professional. They were waiting for the same elevator. Marie said to no one in particular, "It's a shame about the reader." Priya said sorry. The man who was reading to the girl in 412, the custodian, he stopped coming. Marie pressed the elevator button again. She was starting to respond. Priya said, "What do you mean stopped coming?" "Reassigned 3 days ago," Marie looked at her. The mother pulled strings, apparently unauthorized access, but that girl she was opening up hadn't made a sound in 6 weeks, and she started moving toward the door when his shift time came around. The elevator arrived. Marie stepped in. It's a shame. Priya rode to the 28th floor. She sat at her desk. She thought about what she'd heard. She was a junior analyst. This was not her problem. This was not her floor, her department, her concern. She had a presentation to build. She opened her presentation. She stared at it for 11 minutes. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked to the 29th floor where Sandra Cho's office was. Sandra already had doubts. She had had them since she handed Daniel the notice and watched him fold it in half and say, "All right," in that specific, unhurried way. She had looked up his file afterward, the way you look at something you've put down quickly and then return to. She had seen the engineering degree. She had seen 13 years at Holborn Associates. She had thought, a man does not go from that to this without a reason. She had not been sure what the reason changed about anything. When Priya told her what the nurse had said, Sandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled up the access log for room 412. 42nd day, 12:47, duration 22 minutes. 43rd day, no access logged. No other visits from Daniel.She recorded. She pulled the nursing notes for room 412, 42nd through 46th days. Day 42, patient observed in reduced withdrawal posture, book noted on windowsill. Day 43, patient appeared to be waiting, elevated agitation. Day 44, patient showed increased withdrawal, hand observed on windowsill repeatedly. Day 45, patient returned to baseline, closed presentation. Day 46, no change. Sandra set the papers down. Priya said quietly, "I don't know if this helps." "It does," Sandra said. She called Dr. Reeves. Dr. Reeves had been Nora's attending physician for 6 months. He was a man of 51 who had seen enough of children's grief to have developed a clinical stillness around it, and beneath the clinical stillness, something that had not calcified entirely. He had noted in his own logs the change on day 42. He had not known the cause. He knew now. He called Catherine Voss. He did not reach her until 9:17 that evening. She was in her car in the clinic parking structure. She had been upstairs. She had sat with Nora for 45 minutes, and Nora had not turned her head and had not moved her hand from her knee. When Dr. Reeves spoke, Catherine listened. She listened for 4 minutes and 16 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Where is he now?" "Still on the 6th floor roster," Dr. Reeves said, "unless Sandra's updated the schedule." She said, "Thank you." She sat in the car for 18 minutes. She looked at the parking structure's concrete pillars. They were unremarkable, load-bearing, invisible in their function. She drove home. Daniel's address was on his HR file. Apartment 3C, 214 Fenwick Street. Catherine arrived at 7:45 the following morning. She drove herself. She had told Jake she would be in at 10 and not to schedule anything before then. She had not told him where she was going. She parked on Fenwick Street and looked at the building. It was a 5-story walk-up with a painted brick facade, the paint somewhere between beige and the color of old envelopes. There were window boxes on 2 of the units, both tidy, one with something actually growing. She did not know which window was his. She found 3C and knocked. The door opened after 30 seconds. Daniel.She stood in it. He was in his off-duty clothes, dark trousers, a plain white shirt. He was holding a mug of tea. Behind him she could see the kitchen, small, clean, the counter clear except for a cutting board and a potted plant. On the table was a child's school bag, its zipper half open. He looked at her without surprise, without hostility. He said, "Ms. Voss." She said, "I owe you an explanation and an apology." She paused. "I'd like to come in." He considered this for exactly 2 seconds. He stepped back. The apartment was tidy in the way of someone who has made peace with small spaces. The furniture was modest, a sofa, a bookcase, a low coffee table. The bookcase was the most densely occupied thing in the room. She counted from where she stood at least 4 children's books, 2 paperbacks with cracked spines and 1 textbook, Structural Analysis, Principles and Applications, 3rd edition, placed with its spine outward. There was no photograph on the walls. There was one on the shelf, 2 women, one older, one younger, both smiling. She did not ask. He gestured to the sofa. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then thought better of it and sat in the chair across from her. She said, "I asked my staff to look into who had entered my daughter's room. I was told you had accessed it without authorization. I asked Dr. Reeves to make sure it didn't happen again. I did not know." She stopped, started again. "I did not understand what was happening in that room, what you were doing." He held his mug with both hands. He said nothing. "She said she moved toward the door on the days you were expected. The nurses noted it." She looked at her hands. "She's been silent for 7 weeks. She moved toward the door." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then he said she was waiting. "Oh, yes. Children do that." He turned the mug slightly in his hands. "When something becomes safe, they move toward it. It's not complicated." She said, "Will you come back?" He was still for a long moment. He looked past her toward the window. The morning light was flat and even. From outside came the sound of a bus stopping, the release of air brakes, footsteps on pavement. He said, "My daughter goes to Lakeview Primary. She was sick 2 years ago. She's well now." He paused. "When she was sick, I read to her every night, not because the doctors told me to, because it was the only time she stopped being afraid. When someone else's voice was carrying the story, she didn't have to carry anything." He paused again. "Your daughter knows the same thing. She doesn't need me specifically. She needs to know the story doesn't stop." Catherine was quiet. He said, "You pulled me from that room because you were protecting her. I understand that." She said, "I was wrong." "Yes," he said it the way you state a measurement, factual without drama. "You were." She looked at him. She said, "What do you need to come back? I'll make it official. I'll make sure there's a formal arrangement, proper authorization, whatever Sandra needs to." He said, "I have conditions." She said, "Name them." He named 3. He named them in the same even voice in which he had been speaking, the same voice with which he read. He did not raise it. He did not lower it to add weight. He stated them. The first, his assignment to the clinic floors, was to be reinstated. Not as a favor, not as a special arrangement. Reinstated with the reassignment reversed in the official record. The notice was to be corrected to reflect that his entry into room 412 had been, in retrospect, a positive intervention, not a violation. She said, "Done." The second, Dr. Reeves, the nursing staff on floor 4 and Priya Menon, he knew her name from Sandra, who had told him what had happened, were to be formally recognized for their involvement in advocating for Nora's care. In writing. From Catherine directly, not from HR. She looked at him. She said, "The analyst, she's very junior." She went around. He said, "She told the truth when it would have been easier not to." The pause. "Done," she said. The third, when he returned to room 412, Catherine was not to come and watch, not to observe from the corridor, not to ask the nurses to report back what was said or not said. He would read to the girl because the girl needed someone to read to her. That relationship was to remain unmonitored, unmanaged, and not contingent on outcomes that could be measured and reported. Catherine was very still. She said, "She's my daughter." "Yes," he said, "and she will remain your daughter. What happens in that room is not about you." He said it without cruelty. "It's about her. When she's ready to include you, she will." A very long silence. "Done," she said. She stood, she straightened her jacket. She looked for a moment around the room, the bookcase, the textbook, the photograph, the school bag with the half-open zipper. She looked at Daniel. She said, "Why did you do it the first time? You could have kept walking." He considered the question. He said, "A room holding that much weight needs a load-bearing structure. It didn't have one." She absorbed this. She said, "You were an engineer." "I am an engineer," he said. "I also clean floors." She looked at him for 2 more seconds. She thanked him. She let herself out. She walked down the stairs of the building on Fenwick Street and got into her car and sat with her hands on the steering wheel without turning the key. Outside, a child in a school uniform came out of the building's front door, school bag on both shoulders. The child stopped on the step, looked up, and then looked back through the door and called something. A moment later, Daniel Osa came out behind her, still in his white shirt, carrying a packed lunch in one hand and a set of keys in the other. He said something to the child. The child rolled her eyes, the specific theatrical eye roll of an 8-year-old, and they walked to the bus stop together. Catherine watched them. She turned the key. She drove to work. He was back on floor 4 by 1 p.m. Sandra had updated the schedule that morning the moment Catherine's call came in. She had also, on her own initiative, sent Daniel a brief message through the internal system. It said, "Assignment reinstated effective immediately. The record has been corrected. I'm sorry it took this long to get it right." He had replied, "Thank you, Sandra." That was all. At 12:47, he collected his cart, took the book from his breast pocket, he had brought it from home, its bookmark still at page 89, and walked to room 412. He knocked twice, lightly. Inside there was a pause, a sound of movement. He opened the door. The girl was sitting on the edge of the bed, not against the headboard, on the edge, feet almost touching the floor. Her face was turned toward the door. He took the chair by the window. He sat down. He opened the book. He said, page 89, I left off at the Valley of Sound. He read. He read for 22 minutes, then his break was over, he stood, he placed the bookmark, the same folded strip, page 89, continue, at the new page, he set the book on the windowsill. He turned to go. Nora said, what happens next? Her voice was rough in the way of things not recently used, but clear. He turned back. He said, Milo finds a way to bring the sound back. She was quiet for a moment. She said, does it work? Yes, he said, it takes a while, but yes. Another pause. She said, okay. He pulled the door closed. In the corridor, he stood for exactly 3 seconds. Then he pushed his cart to the supply room, restocked it, and went back to work. He did not tell anyone what had been said. He did not report it to Dr. Reeves or Sandra or anyone else. He returned to room 412 the following day at 12:47, and the day after and the day after that. Some days Nora spoke, some days she didn't. He read either way. By the 6th day, she was asking questions about the plot. By the 9th day, she had moved the chair, feeling her way around the room with careful, deliberate hands, so that it faced his chair rather than the headboard. On the 11th day, she said, do you have a daughter? He said, I do. What's her name? Zamara. A pause. Does she like this book? She did when she was 7, now she thinks she's too old for it. A very small sound from the girl in the chair, not quite a laugh, something in the neighborhood of one. How old is she? Light. She's not too old. No, he said, she's not. Catherine knew none of the specifics. She had agreed to the conditions and she kept to them. She did not ask the nurses. She did not look through the corridor window when she arrived at 6:30. She sat with Nora and talked, as she always did, about small things, the weather, the office, nothing of consequence. On the 15th day since Daniel's return, she arrived at 6:30 and Nora said, Mom. Catherine stopped. Nora said, can you sit closer? Catherine moved her chair closer. Nora said, there's a book on the windowsill. Can you read me the page it's open to? Catherine reached for the book. She found the page. It was somewhere near the end. Milo, returning from the lands beyond, carrying the light back to the kingdom of wisdom. She read. Her voice was not as even as she would have liked. She got through the page. She closed the book. Nora's hand moved across the bed and found her mother's hand. They sat like that for 20 minutes without either of them saying anything else. When Catherine left, she walked to her car and sat in it in the parking structure and was quiet for a very long time. She was not crying exactly. It was something adjacent to crying, the thing that comes before or after, when the body understands something the mind has not yet found words for. She had managed in her life to be competent in most of the rooms she entered. She had not, until this moment, understood that competence and presence were not the same thing, and that she had confused them for a very long time. 14 days after Daniel's reinstatement, Catherine sent 3 letters. She wrote them herself, not Jake. She wrote them on plain paper, not letterhead. She sat at her kitchen table at 10:30 at night and wrote in longhand. The first was to Dr. Reeves. It said in part that his judgment and his willingness to make a difficult call had made a difference she had not adequately recognized, and that she wanted to correct that. The second was to the nursing staff of Floor 4, addressed collectively, since she did not know all their names, though she had asked and learned them. It said that their observations and their advocacy for their patient had mattered, and that she saw it. The third was to Priya Menon, junior analyst, 28th floor. It said, you went to Sandra Cho when it would have been easier not to. You were 24 years old and you were right and you acted on being right. That is harder than it sounds. I wanted you to know that I know it. She signed all 3 letters by hand. She brought them in the following morning. She gave them to Jake to deliver personally. Jake delivered them. He did not read them first, which was slightly unusual for him. He left each envelope sealed. The public moment happened not because Catherine engineered it, but because it happened in the only place it could have happened. On the 21st day, Daniel was reading in room 412 when he heard voices in the corridor. He recognized Catherine's voice, lower than usual, careful. He recognized another voice, Dr. Reeves. A third voice, Sandra. He continued reading. When he finished the chapter, he closed the book. He stood. Nora said, "Is my mother out there?" He listened. The voices had stopped. "I think so," he said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know how to just sit," she said. It was not accusatory. It was the observation of someone who had spent a long time paying attention. He said, "She's learning." Another pause. "She came to see you, didn't she, at your house?" "Oh, yes." "Did she apologize?" "Oh, yes." Nora turned the information over. Was she sorry? He thought about Catherine sitting at his kitchen table with her hands folded, the plainness of her face when she'd said I was wrong. The 18 minutes she'd sat in the parking structure the first night. The letters she'd written herself instead of asking Jake. He said, "Yes, I think she was." Nora said, "Okay." She stood, she felt for the wall, found it, and moved along it toward the door with the practiced economy of someone who has learned the dimensions of her room the way others learn them by sight. She opened the door. Catherine was there in the corridor with Dr. Reeves and Sandra, who both took one step back as the door opened. Nora stood in the doorway. She looked, the word was inaccurate and the only word available, toward her mother. She said, "You can come in." Catherine came in. What happened in room 412 in the next half hour was not witnessed by Daniel, who went back to his cart and his work, or by Dr. Reeves or Sandra, who found things to attend to elsewhere on the floor. Whatever happened, at the end of it, Nora was sitting in the chair that had been moved to face the window, and Catherine was sitting in the chair beside her, and both of them were quiet in the way of people who have finally found the same room. The formal conversation happened in the clinic corridor 2 days later, when Daniel's shift was ending. Catherine was waiting for him. She was in the corridor, no Jake, no assistant, no briefcase. She had come from the office. She was in a suit, but she had taken off her jacket and folded it over one arm. She said, "I want to say it properly, where it happened." He waited. She said, "I had you moved because I thought I was protecting my daughter. I was wrong about what protection meant. You understood something about her that I hadn't been able to reach, and instead of being grateful, I treated it as a threat. I'm sorry." He said nothing for a moment. She said, "The record is corrected. The letters are written. I know those are the conditions, and I know they don't cover this part." He said, "No, they don't." She looked at him. He said, "You've already done the hard part. You came to Fenwick Street, that was the hard part." She said, "Was it enough?" He said, "I'm here, aren't I?" She absorbed this. She said, "You were a structural engineer." "Yes." "For 13 years." "Yes." "And you left because—" "My daughter needed me to be somewhere else." He said it without invitation for further comment. She was quiet. She looked at the corridor, the fluorescent lights, the pale linoleum, the supply cart parked outside the room. She said, "You don't want to come back to that." He said, "I didn't say that." The pause. She said, "We have a capital infrastructure division. We've been without a senior structural analyst for 7 months. The role has been posted, but we haven't found the right." He said, "Ms. Voss." She stopped. He said, "Right now your daughter is in room 412 and she has been asked a question and she is thinking about the answer. That's what matters right now." He picked up his card. "Let's see what she says first." Catherine looked at him for a moment. Then something happened to her face, not quite a smile, but the predecessor to one, the expression that lives just before the muscles commit. She put her jacket back on. She said, "All right." She walked back to room 412. Daniel pushed his cart toward the elevator. Epilogue: The Legacy. He finished the book on a Thursday. The last chapter, the last page. Milo returning home, the lands beyond receding, the world ordinary and full again. He closed it. Nora was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What do we read next?" He had brought another book. He had been fairly sure she would ask. He took it from his pocket, The Hobbit, water-stained cover, cracked spine, the copy that had belonged to Grace's mother. He said, "This one takes longer." She said, "Okay." He said, "Page 1, he opened it. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. The nursing log for room 412, week 6 of Daniel's visits, contains the following note, written by Marie in her handwriting. Patient vocalizing regularly. Initiated conversation with mother during evening visit. Requested shared reading time with mother present, responding positively to ward staff. Clinical team cautiously optimistic. The notation does not mention Daniel by name. He had asked in his quiet way that it not. He said the progress was Nora's progress. It had nothing to do with him. Marie had written the note accordingly, and then had added in the margin in smaller writing a single sentence she did not intend for the official file. Someone brought the sound back. 3 months after the day he first knocked on the door of room 412, Daniel Osai's HR file at Meridian Complex was updated. The update noted that his performance review had been elevated to distinguished. It noted a commendation from the clinic's senior attending physician. It noted, in a separate addendum drafted by Catherine Voss and countersigned by Sandra Cho, that his intervention in the care of a pediatric patient had demonstrated judgment and compassion of an uncommon order. The file also noted a lateral transfer agreed upon, formal, fully documented, to the firm's Capital Infrastructure Division as Senior Structural Analyst commencing the following quarter. The position was to be structured around school hours. The provision was explicit. Daniel had read the transfer offer 3 times. He had folded it in half as he folded most pieces of paper. He had placed it in his breast pocket. He had said, "All right." On his last day in the gray uniform, Sandra came to find him before his shift ended. She said, "How does it feel?" He looked at his cart, at the supply room, at the fluorescent corridor that smelled like antiseptic and where he had eaten his lunch on an upturned bucket for 2 years and 4 months. He said, "It feels like it was exactly what it was supposed to be." She said, "That's a very calm way to see it." He said the work was good, the floors were clean. He pushed the cart back to its place. "That's enough." He washed his hands at the corridor sink. He collected his bag. He walked to room 412 and knocked twice lightly, and went in for the last time in the gray uniform to read the next chapter of The Hobbit to a girl who had found her voice in the space between one sentence and the next. Outside the window, the light was late afternoon, coming through glass, warm and without preference, falling on the clean floors, on the supply cart, on the scratch marks in the corridor linoleum, on the chair that had been moved to face another chair. Falling on the girl who was listening. Falling on the man who was reading. Falling on everything equally, as light does, asking nothing, offering everything, requiring only that someone be present to receive it. He read until the chapter ended. He closed the book. The room held the silence the way a good structure holds its load, invisibly everywhere at once, without needing anyone to notice. Nora said, "Same time tomorrow." He said, "Same time tomorrow." He stood. He left. In the corridor, the cart was where he'd left it. The fluorescent lights hummed their single steady note. The floors were clean. He went home to Amara.